He was publicly humiliated in a coffee shop, all because of a bright red MAGA hat he wore with quiet confidence. The barista turned his simple cappuccino order into a full-blown political spectacle, with the crowd laughing and phones recording every second. What no one knew was that this so-called fanatic owned the entire coffee chain. What he did next left everyone stunned and taught a lesson they'd never forget. Dan, a sharp-dressed man in his late 40s, walks into Freedom Bean, a trendy coffee shop nestled in the heart of downtown. His tailored suit screams success, but it's the bright red MAGA hat perched confidently on his head that grabs everyone's attention. The place is alive with the soft hum of conversation, accompanied by smooth jazz playing in the background. The air smells of freshly brewed espresso and baked goods, an idyllic morning for most, except for Zack. Zack, the barista behind the counter, is a walking Pinterest board of Gen Z rebellion. His neon purple hair is tied up in a messy bun. His oversized no borders, no masters t-shirt drapes over skinny jeans, and his face is locked in a smirk the moment he spots Dan. Zack's eyes narrow as he makes a show of dramatically fanning his nose, as if Dan's presence has brought in some unbearable stench. "Wow," Zack says, loud enough for the room to hear. "A MAGA hat? In this coffee shop? Bold move." The room shifts. Conversations pause. Heads turn toward Dan, and a murmur ripples through the patrons. A couple of people pull out their phones, sensing that something entertaining, or maybe viral, is about to unfold. Dan doesn't flinch. His calm demeanor is unshaken as he approaches the counter. He studies the menu briefly, then looks directly at Zack. "Good morning. I'll have a large cappuccino, extra foam, please," Dan says, his tone polite but firm. Zack folds his arms and leans forward, his smirk growing wider. "Oh, sorry, I didn't realize we were serving oppression this morning," he says with mock sincerity, throwing in a theatrical shrug. A few snickers escape from the nearby tables. Dan doesn't react. Instead, he calmly pulls out his wallet and slides a crisp $10 bill across the counter. "I thought you made coffee, not political statements. But okay, let's keep it moving." Zack straightens up, his face flushing slightly. He wasn't expecting such a composed response, but instead of backing down, he doubles down. He grabs a marker and scribbles something on the side of the cup before handing it off to the barista station. "Order for Defender of White-Collar Privilege," Zack shouts, his voice ringing through the shop like a bell. The crowd erupts into laughter. A few people clap. Phones are now fully raised, recording the scene. Dan, still calm, steps aside to wait for his drink. His face betrays nothing, but his presence is a quiet statement of defiance. The room buzzes with tension as everyone wonders what, if anything, he'll do next. Dan folds his hands behind his back, standing tall as the barista slides his cup onto the counter. A faint smirk tugs at the corner of his mouth as he looks at the cup. Whatever Zack wrote on it, Dan isn't about to let it ruin his morning. He picks it up, takes a slow sip, and glances at Zack one last time. "Great cappuccino," Dan says, nodding slightly. "I'll be sure to let the owner know about your creativity." Dan waits calmly at the pickup counter as Zack busies himself with exaggerated movements, intentionally slowing down the preparation of the cappuccino. The tension in the room has escalated into a palpable spectacle, with patrons watching like an audience at an unsanctioned comedy show. Zack's smirk widens as he finally places the cup on the counter with a loud thunk, pushing it toward Dan with an almost theatrical flourish. Dan picks up the cup, pausing for a moment as he notices something unusual. On the lid, in bold black marker, are the words, "No MAGA Welcome Here." The room collectively holds its breath. Dan tilts the cup slightly, examining Zack's artistry with the curiosity of a museum critic. Then, with perfect composure, he raises the cup slightly in acknowledgement and turns to address the room. "Ah," he says with a calm, deliberate tone. "I see you offer an extra service here. Creative insults. How much do you charge for that, or is it complimentary with a cappuccino?" The room erupts in laughter. Even a few of Zack's sympathizers can't help but chuckle. Zack, who had been basking in his moment of glory, suddenly looks less certain. His cheeks flush, but instead of backing down, he doubles down. Reaching for his phone, Zack snaps a quick photo of Dan holding the cup. He types furiously, his thumbs practically flying over the screen. Moments later, the post is live. This is what entitlement looks like. We don't serve oppression here. For a moment, Zack basks in his digital triumph, proudly showing the post to the nearest customer, who nods approvingly. But within minutes, the comment section begins to light up. Not just with likes from his echo chamber, but with a deluge of angry responses from people who don't share Zack's worldview. What happened to coffee for everyone? Way to stereotype. You just lost a customer. Freedom of speech goes both ways, Zack. Maybe you should learn that. Meanwhile, outside the coffee shop, a young woman with dyed pink hair and a megaphone begins to stage an impromptu protest. She holds up a sign reading, "Boycott Hate," and shouts slogans about rejecting MAGA culture. Zack, thrilled by the attention, runs outside to join her, leaving his co-worker to cover the counter alone. "Free lattes for anyone who takes a selfie with the protest," Zack yells, waving customers over to the makeshift picket line. A handful of people comply, grinning as they pose with their drinks and anti-MAGA signs in front of the shop. Inside, Dan watches the scene unfold through the glass, his expression unreadable. He takes another slow sip of his coffee, savoring it as if he's at a leisurely brunch rather than the center of a swirling social media storm. As Zack re-enters the shop, clearly riding high on his newfound sense of purpose, Dan sets his cup down and calmly approaches the counter. "Good luck with the PR, kid," Dan says, his voice low but firm. "You might want to think about who's really watching. And trust me, life has a funny way of teaching lessons. We'll meet again." Without waiting for a response, Dan turns and exits the coffee shop, leaving Zack standing behind the counter, staring at the door. The room is quiet now, the spectacle over, but the air is charged with anticipation, as if everyone knows the story isn't finished. The next morning, the atmosphere at Freedom Bean is electric. The coffee shop is overflowing with people, a mix of Zack's supporters and those outraged by his antics. A crowd has gathered outside, some holding signs that say, "Support Zack," while others wave banners reading, "Coffee should unite, not divide." Inside, the line stretches to the door, but the tension in the air is thicker than the smell of espresso. Zack is in his element, basking in the attention as he works the counter with exaggerated confidence. Every latte he hands out comes with a comment designed to stoke the fire. "Careful, this drink doesn't pair well with oppression," he quips to one customer, earning a chuckle from a small group nearby. As the morning chaos swirls, the door swings open and in walks Dan. This time, he isn't alone. Flanking him are two sharply dressed attorneys, their briefcases gleaming and their expressions all business. The room falls into a hush as Dan strides to the counter, his red MAGA hat still perched proudly on his head. Zack notices him immediately, his smirk widening into a full-blown grin. "Oh, look who's back," Zack says, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Here for another cappuccino? Let me add an extra shot of patience this time. You'll need it." Dan doesn't respond. Instead, he nods toward one of the attorneys, who steps forward and pulls out a clipboard. "Excuse me," the attorney says to the shop's manager, a middle-aged woman who has been nervously observing the growing spectacle. "We need to speak with you about yesterday's incident and some operational concerns." The manager's eyes widen, and she stammers, "Oh, of course, right this way." She leads the attorneys to the back office, leaving Zack alone at the counter. Zack, unfazed, leans against the espresso machine and addresses Dan directly. "What's this? Some kind of intimidation tactic? Let me guess. You're suing me for hurting your feelings?" He sneers. Dan finally speaks, his voice calm but commanding. "No lawsuits, just business." Zack raises an eyebrow but says nothing. Meanwhile, the attorneys emerge from the back office with the manager, who now looks visibly shaken. She approaches Dan, hands trembling as she offers him a set of keys. "Mr. Carter," she says, her voice barely above a whisper, "we weren't aware you'd be visiting personally." Welcome. The room goes silent, save for the hiss of steaming milk. Zack's smirk falters as he looks between Dan and the manager. Wait, what? Zack stammers, his cocky demeanor starting to crack. Dan adjusts his MAGA hat slightly and turns to face the room, his voice carrying the weight of authority. Let me clear things up for everyone. My company recently acquired this coffee shop as part of a larger deal. I came in yesterday to see how things were running. He pauses, letting the weight of his words settle. Zack's face drains of color. And, Zack, Dan continues, pulling out his phone. Remember yesterday's little performance? Let's review. He plays a video on his screen, showing the scene from the day before. The mocking tone, the insult written on the cup, the crowd's laughter. It's all there. The room watches in stunned silence, some patrons shifting uncomfortably in their seats. You've made quite the impression, Dan says, locking eyes with Zack. Do you have any idea how many customers we lost in the last 24 hours because of your policy? Zack stammers. I was just... You were just what? Making coffee? Or making political statements? Dan interrupts, his voice sharp. Because I can assure you, the latter is not in your job description. The tension in the room shifts. The crowd, once leaning towards Zack's side, begins murmuring in agreement with Dan. You're lucky I believe in second chances, Dan says, his tone softening slightly. But those chances come with accountability. So here's how this is going to go. Dan gestures toward the attorneys, who step forward with documents in hand. We'll be implementing new policies to ensure this shop becomes a space for everyone. No exceptions. And as for you, Zack, consider this your first and final warning. The room buzzes with whispers, as Zack stands frozen, his earlier bravado completely gone. The tables have turned and everyone knows it. Anne steps forward, commanding the attention of everyone in the shop. The tension is thick, and Zack, still pale from the earlier revelation, fidgets behind the counter. Dan's calm demeanor only amplifies the weight of his next words. I'm not a fan of firing people, Dan begins, his voice steady but firm. I believe in giving people a chance to learn, to grow, to understand the value of respect, especially when it's in short supply. The crowd murmurs, a mix of curiosity and anticipation. Dan continues, his tone sharpening just slightly. So, Zack, here's the deal. You're not losing your job today, but you are about to find out what it means to truly listen to others, particularly those who don't share your worldview. Zack's eyes narrow. What's that supposed to mean? Dan smiles faintly. It means that for the next week, you'll be working at our new initiative, something I like to call the Reconciliation Bar. It's a special pop-up coffee counter where we serve great drinks and, more importantly, conversations. The crowd leans in, intrigued. Zack, however, scoffs. What? You want me to, chat with MAGA people all day? That's ridiculous. Dan tilts his head slightly, his expression calm but unyielding. What's ridiculous is judging people by what they wear or what they believe, instead of what kind of person they are. Your task will be simple. Make coffee, serve it with respect, and talk, really talk, to anyone who sits at your bar. No snark, no politics, just human connection. The room buzzes with whispers, some laughing at the irony of Zack being forced to take the very role he had mocked. Zack's face twists with indignation. You can't make me do that! Dan nods toward his attorneys, who step forward. One of them, a tall woman with an air of authority, speaks up. Refusal to comply with this reassignment would be considered insubordination under your employment contract. You're welcome to discuss it further, but I wouldn't recommend it. Zack looks around, desperate for support, but the crowd has shifted. The people who had cheered him on before now watch with a mix of amusement and expectation. A young woman in the corner calls out, Come on, Zack. You wanted to prove your point, right? Here's your chance. Another voice chimes in. Yeah, man. You were all about making statements yesterday. Let's see how you do when it's face to face. Zack flushes, realizing there's no graceful way out. With a deep sigh, he mutters, Fine. Whatever. I'll do it. Dan smiles. Good choice. The reconciliation bar opens tomorrow morning. Be there at 7 a.m. sharp. The crowd erupts into applause, some laughing and others nodding in approval. Dan steps closer to Zack, lowering his voice just enough for only him to hear. And, Zack, this isn't just a punishment. It's an opportunity. Don't waste it. Zack, still bristling, says nothing, but the flicker of doubt in his eyes suggests he understands the gravity of what lies ahead. Chased 5. A week later, the coffee shop is unrecognizable. The once divisive atmosphere has been replaced with a welcoming vibe. The shop's name now reads in bold letters above the door. Freedom Bean, coffee for all. Beneath it, the new tagline beams from a sleek metal sign, We brew coffee, not politics. Inside, the transformation is just as striking. The walls, once cluttered with politically charged posters, are now adorned with neutral, inviting art. Steaming coffee cups, warm landscapes, and a giant chalkboard that reads, Start a conversation, not a fight. The menu features playful drink names like the Unity Latte and Civic Brew, reinforcing the shop's commitment to inclusivity. Behind the counter, Zack stands in a crisp black apron, noticeably subdued. Gone is his cocky smirk and sarcastic quips. Instead, his demeanor is professional, almost apologetic. He works quickly and quietly, glancing up occasionally at the customers, as if gauging their reactions. The bell above the door jingles, and in walks Dan, his signature red MAGA hat unmistakable. This time, he's not alone. A small crew of cameras follows him, capturing the moment for what is clearly a planned social media feature. The room falls into a brief hush before customers, recognizing Dan, break into smiles and quiet murmurs of approval. Dan surveys the room, nodding in satisfaction. He walks up to the counter, where Zack freezes momentarily before regaining his composure. Good morning, Zack, Dan says, his voice warm but measured. How's business? Zack clears his throat, nervously adjusting his apron. It's good. Busy. Really busy. That's what I like to hear, Dan replies with a faint smile. I'll have a cappuccino. Extra foam, please. Zack hesitates for a fraction of a second, but quickly gets to work. The cameras pan across the shop, capturing the new, vibrant energy. Customers chat at tables, some even engaging in the conversations encouraged by the shop's new motto. A couple at the reconciliation bar laugh as they exchange stories over their coffee, embodying the change Dan envisioned. As Zack places the finished cappuccino on the counter, he looks up at Dan, his expression a mix of nervousness and sincerity. Dan picks up the cup, takes a sip, and nods. Not bad, Zack. Not bad at all. The tension in the room dissolves into quiet applause from a few patrons. Dan looks directly at Zack, his tone shifting to something more personal. Remember, it's not about agreeing with everyone. It's about treating people like people, judging them by their actions, not their hats. He pauses, then adds with a grin. And for the record, this cappuccino is excellent. Zack exhales a small, relieved laugh. Thanks, I guess. Dan turns to leave but stops at the door, glancing back at Zack with one final comment. Keep it up. You've got potential. Don't waste it. The cameras capture the moment as Dan exits, leaving Zack standing at the counter, thoughtful and slightly humbled.